Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a ride along in an ambulance in this round with Peter Yates's Mother Jugs and Speed versus Martin Scorsese's Bringing Out the Dead. And, this was a real hard one because, both of these movies are great in their own way. And so let's kick it off with Peter Yates's Mother Jugs and Speed. Of course, Peter Yates, most notable for directing Bullet, as well as The Friends of Eddie Coyle, The Hot Rock, and The Deep. And this movie is great. It's very well cast, very well written, very well executed. The title characters, Mother, Jugs, and Speed. Bill Cosby is Mother, Raquel Welch is Jugs, and Harvey Keitel is Speed. And, and that opening monologue that Alan Garfield has is the head of the ambulance driver, the head of the ambulance dispatch, it's fucking brilliant, but like Bill Cosby is Mother, he's one of the fastest ambulance drivers. He has a badass rig and all this shit. And like Bill Cosby displays a large amount of range in this shit because like he, you really feel the emotions. Like when Bruce Davison, his partner as the ambulance driver, he gets shot by that woman wanting drugs and stuff. You really feel that shit. And it's just like there's a scene in the film where we see Bill Cosby at a massage parlor getting massaged by with a couple of vibrators, and there's also a point in it where he takes a needle and shoots a woman in the ass with a needle, and it's just she says just don't do anything weird this time or any so it insinuates that it's an ongoing thing. And, given what we know about what Cosby was accused of, it just is a little like, it's a little weird because, just these motherfuckers have been telling you this shit through their films and their shows and all this stuff. And, so like for all you conspiracy theorists out there, stick that in your craw and chew on it for a while, because it's just a little creepy. And then you have Raquel Welch as Jugs, she's fucking incredible. Adjectives aren't good enough to describe how like beautiful, wonderful, like amazing, talented this woman was. Rest in peace. Finer than frog hair. And this is a point in her career where she was doing more serious roles. She kind of, matured out of being the mindless sex pot that she got made famous by in 1 million years BC. But here, like, it was a turning point, at the beginning of the 70s, like when she did Myra Breckinridge and Haney Calder soon after that she started doing more movies like this. And, she's the secretary who, she takes night classes to be, ambulance driver. And of course she gets met with opposition because, as Alan Garfield says, nobody's gonna want to go ride in a woman ambulance drive, or an ambulance if a woman's driving it. And, of course Alan Garfield was always great at playing an asshole, and he does it superbly as the head of the ambulance dispatch. Like I said, that opening monologue is great. And like anytime he's on the screen, he's stealing the show, just a really great, very underrated actor. And of course, his ragtag bunch of fucking ambulance drivers, Larry Hagman plays a really good piece of shit in the film. And of course, like Bruce Davison, his death is very devastating in the film. And, and then Harvey Keitel comes in as Speed. He's kind of the hot shot. He's the only one in the film that actually fucks Raquel Welch. And Lord knows Larry Hagman tries, very much so. But fails miserably. And so that's maybe part of the reason why, he's shooting up the place at the end of the film. And, also probably because he gets fucking ass whooped in the middle of it. And, the film's got a lot of like highs and lows, and all these crazy emotions and shit. And, and it's very, like I said, very well written and, really like shows you like all the shit that these people go through. A lot of funny moments and stuff, like when they're trying to like, take that big lady out on the stretcher and then they fall through the stairs and then she like rolls down the fucking stairs and all the way into the street and through the street and then hits the car. Like that is one of the funniest scenes I've ever seen in a film. And then like moving forward to Martin Scorsese's Bringing Out the Dead, it deals with similar things. We see Nicolas Cage as an ambulance driver who's like, kind of had his, kind of over his job. He's at his wits' end. He hasn't really saved a life in a while. People keep dying on him. He's seeing ghosts. Particularly one of the girl that he couldn't save, and he's just haunted by it as he goes through. And he's really trying to get fired from his job, but he can't because they're so short staffed. No, as like Ving Rhames said, nobody gets fired. It's just fucking crazy. That his fellow drivers in the film are John Goodman, Ving Rhames, and Tom Sizemore, and each one great in their own right. Three very great actors. And like John Goodman's more of the comic relief, and like Ving Rhames is like, he's got a lot of funny moments. He's just a badass motherfucker. And the scene where they like put the Narcan on the that musician, and I be banging, that's fucking hilarious because he makes it look like a miracle and all this shit. And there's just, and all the shit that like, his little rapport with Nicolas Cage is like, it's just fucking hilarious. And then Tom Sizemore, he could easily be the most psychotic one in the movie and shit, and of course, then you got Patricia Arquette is kind of the love interest. She's the daughter of a patient they took in who like should be dead, but he's still clinging on to life, and he's dealing with that, and it's just and the use of music in this film. The song TV Sheets by Van Morrison is kind of like the unofficial theme song of the movie. Scorsese uses it all throughout the film, and it really adds, it kind of accentuates what's going on with it and stuff. And you really get, it's like most Scorsese films, it's all about the atmosphere. And the thing about it is, whether or not Scorsese gives a fuck about the material, he will find something that he gives a fuck about. This was the fourth time that he directed a Paul Schrader script. Of course, the first time being Taxi Driver, and then also Raging Bull and The Last Temptation of Christ. But here we get Bringing Out the Dead, which kind of has some Taxi Driver vibes, especially with the atmospheric stuff and the nightmarish quality of New York. Like, I've never been to New York, but I feel like I have, because Scorsese's taken me there so many times, and and it's always different. Nicolas Cage as well. For people give him shit. Is he a good actor or not? But say what you will about the man, but he's really good at playing unhinged. And the thing about it is, it's never the same unhinged. It's always like different shades of unhinged. And this man is a really brilliant actor, very underrated, and he really gives a hell of a performance in this shit. Everybody's great, but that ending is such bullshit, because in the end he like finally pulls the plug on the patient that he brought in, by saving Mark Anthony, who's the fucking tweaker, and all this fucking shit. There's a lot of heavy-handed symbolism that doesn't really mean shit. Typical Paul Schrader bullshit. Other than like Taxi Driver, he really hasn't really had a great ending for a movie. And it's just that heavy. He kills the father, and then he ends up with the daughter that's supposed to be his savior. It's just it's fucking bullshit. So that's that's why like the round clearly goes to Mother Jugs and Speed, because it's got a way better ending. You get a lot more emotion too, because it's like with Bringing Out the Dead, it's very flashy. Scorsese knows how to make a movie interesting. He knows how to use the camera angles. Like the amount of fucking camera angles that he uses to film ambulances is fucking nuts. The flashing lights. He knows how to make a movie compelling and really pull your attention in, but it usually overshadows a very mid movie, especially if Paul Schrader wrote it, except with the exception of the other three. So it's usually when Paul Schrader usually saves the shit for himself, but he could have just been going through the motions, because the other three that he did, that Scorsese directed, were fucking amazing. Something he's no Robert Town, but he definitely is one of the greatest screenwriters in Hollywood. You know, definitely like kind of in a weird moment in his career when he wrote this, I suppose. But you know, it also adapted from a book, so you know, it could be just a whole thing. Is like, you know, maybe they just wanted to do a movie about New York in the early '90s, and this was the best shit they could come up with. You know, and definitely like, you know, as far as like way music's used, you could say Bringing Out the Dead did it better, but you know, it definitely like Scorsese's a way better director than Peter Yates, but Mother Jugs and Speed might be the best movie Peter Yates made. You know, as far as an actual good movie, may not be like iconic like Bullet or anything, but you know, it's just a movie that's fun, entertaining, but also has like a message, a little bit, you know, a lot of social commentary. You know, you actually give a fuck about these people. I don't really give a fuck. You know, it's like watching a train wreck to see Nicolas Cage be unhinged. You know, it's a masterclass in acting as far as like how to be play fucked up crazy, you know. But as far as like an actual good movie, you know, the ending kills it, you know. So for anybody keeping score, the 70s win this round. That 1921, the 90s are still up by 2, but the, you know, it's movies like Mother Jugs and Speed is what makes the 70s like the greatest decade of all time for filmmaking, because you know, this is one of the crown jewels of 70s cinema, and you know, it's just, you know, really great. Everybody involved is great. You know, the writing's exceptional. So 1921, 90s are still up by 2, but you know, the 70s are coming back. You know, like it's straight up sizzling is what it is. So like I said, if I've said anything wrong or anything you disagree with, or if you have any recommendations, you know, I'm open to collaborations. Also eviscerate me in the comments. I don't care. I'm basically working on the rough draft of my doctoral thesis, you know, because like, you know, call it a personal journey, academia, whatever the fuck. I just got to know which decade is better, the 70s or the 90s. And, you know, currently 90s up by 2, but the 70s, they always can surprise you with these fucking classics. So, you know, I'm having fun. How about y'all?